There was no point in walking. There was no point in struggling over pressure ridges, fighting through pools of water, plodding through snow that reached them to the waist. There was no point in dragging the heavy lifeboats slowly like time over the white rage of the Weddell Sea. There was no point, because they didn't move forwards. The only thing they got from the march were broken boats and painful exhaustion, and they pitched a camp on the ice, which became their home. It remained their home all until the boredom turned them into their own enemies, until the weeks drove them crazy, until hope left its room inside their chests with the door swinging in the wind. Shackleton took them marching again, stubbornly treading towards the islands, while the ice drove them wherever the ice wanted to drive them. Shivering, tired and hungry, they had to give up once again. They had to give up and yield to the arms of patience, because they could do nothing else than wait for the ice to open, allowing them to put the boats in the water. Once again they pitched their stormy camp and took the meagre stores off the sledges, imprisoned on an ice floe, a thin sheet of frozen water between them and the abyss of the sea. They called it Patience Camp. There was nothing to see when the thick fog pressed upon the eternally white landscape. There was nothing to do when the raging cold was storming, keeping them paralyzed in their sleeping bags. There was nothing to warm them when slush and snow, rain and melting ice filled their clothes and their frozen, stiff sleeping gear. And there was nothing to eat when the last mouthfuls of dog pemmican and blubber had been swallowed. Not even the penguins wanted to visit them. Sometimes they took the sledges back to Ocean Camp, the old camp, to salvage something that had been left behind. But the ice became more and more treacherous, and soon it would no longer allow such journeys. Macklin could never forget how he'd prepared the harnesses of his dogs for one last trip, happy to have a break from the emptiness. With high hopes he lay down in his wet sleeping bag that night, with one single thing to look forward to, with one single thing in his dreams, one thing that could raise his mind from the thoughts of hunger, cold, and boredom. He lay down in the slush in the tent. The night was painful, like so many other nights, and sleep refused to put its dry, warm blanket over Macklin. It was wet, sucking, dripping wet, and drops fell from the flapping tent cloth. The gasping cold crackled in their clothes. The wind shouted and cried. Macklin lay close to his 7 tent mates, as still as possible not to let cold air into the sleeping bag. They rested on top of each other, bearded, filthy, with torn clothing, with faces black of soot, and tried to escape into their own dreams. Old Lees was snoring with a roar, and didn't give up even though Greenstreet kicked him in the head. Blackborough joined in with hissing buzzes, and by the soaked opening Worsley twisted impatiently, rustling in the frost. Macklin closed his eyes, pressed them together tightly, and tried to think about tomorrow's trip, the only thing he had. But when morning arrived, fog came sneaking up on them, suffocatingly thick with whirling snow, and the ice was restlessly wandering, closing the road he was about to take. And Shackleton came into their tent. "Forget the trip, Mac," he said. "The weather's too bad. We can never again get back to Ocean Camp." When he had left, Clark, the tall dour one who'd never used to talk, spoke and mumbled, "One would have known that." "Shut up!" Macklin hissed. He wanted to pull his sleeping bag over his head, but it was wet and hostile. They sat around the tent pole, all 8, wet through, and drank their weak powdered milk through frost-bitten lips. It was their only hot drink. There was no food, no breakfast. There was only the milk to comfort their stiff bodies. Macklin wanted to close his eyes and disappear into the liquid, but Clark sighed grumpily. "I say what I want." He said it quietly to himself, tired, frozen, and fed up, with his head bent over the mug to find mild air in the steam. He said it simply, but the words tore in Macklin's heart like a wicked laughter. The quarrel burnt like wild flames of fire. Worsley, the surging one, joined in, and so did old Lise, until the tent was boiling, storming in rage. Macklin was so tired, he remembered, of more than the snow and the cold and the hunger and the wind. He was so tired of his 7 tent mates, whose faces were the only thing he saw during all those gloomy days, when the weather kept them prisoners in the tent. He was so tired of their voices, of their stories, and of the sound of their breath. He was so tired of their movements and of the looks in their eyes. For months, slow, biting months, he had them close by, so close that he could feel the breath rustle against the skin of his neck. He could no longer stand them. He couldn't stand Clark's reserved and sullen ways, or Worsley's flooding, capricious ways. He couldn't stand the immaturely young Blackborough or Rickenson who dared complain about the cold. He couldn't stand Greenstreet or Kerr who didn't bother anyone at all. And he was so annoyed that he could fall into frenzy by old Lise, the one they all disliked, whose collection of garbage occupied 1/3 of the tent, and who was all finicky and strange. And the quarrel made the tent shiver. In the whirling excitement, the roaring bangs, Greenstreet upset his milk, and he blamed it on Clark with barking shouts. "Are you completely damned stupid?" he screamed. But when he turned silent to catch his breath, the rage disappeared, and his eyes fell into the snow like a rock. His eyes fell into the snow, and every mouth turned mute. His eyes fell into the snow that soaked up his milk, greedily and devastating, forever. Greenstreet's lips shivered. His sooty face flickered. The eyes filled up with tears. Then Clark leant forwards, without words, without a change in his face, and poured some of his own milk into Greenstreet's mug. Then Worsley did the same, and Macklin too, and they filled the mug together, Rickenson, Kerr, old Lise, and Blackborough. Nobody spoke after that. Greenstreet swallowed and blinked. They drank their milk quietly. Macklin remembered how he looked at them, at their dirty, bearded faces, at their greasy strands of hair that hung from their worn-out helmets. There were no better men, no better comrades. He could endure everything in their company.